My name is Sarah McDonald, and this is Obsessions. The test will measure whether you are an informed, engaged, and productive citizen of the world, and it will take place in schools, and bars, and hospitals, and dorm rooms, and in places of worship. You will be tested on first dates, in job interviews, while watching football, and while scrolling through your Twitter feed. The test will judge your ability to think about things other than celebrity marriages, whether you'll be easily persuaded by empty political rhetoric, and whether you'll be able to place your life and your community in a broader context. The test will last your entire life, and it will be comprised of millions of decisions that, when taken together, will make your life yours, and everything will be on it. Crash Course World History, John Green. Our America, our internet, is not ancient Athens. It's Rome. And your problem is that you think you're in the forum when you're really in the circus. The Aesthetic. ContraPoints, Natalie Wynn. So why are women obsessed with murder? Why is this content so popular, specifically with women, and what does it say about our society? One of my favorite YouTube genres, apart from video essays and true crime content, is commentary. Commentary on YouTube is basically just gossip. Sometimes, after a long day, I like to unwind with a snack, a furry animal curled up in my lap, and a 45-minute long YouTube video about someone I've never heard of behaving badly amongst other people I don't and will never know. The domestic struggles and dramas of celebrities are common topics of discussion, as is the behavior of assorted internet personalities and creators. Gossip is defined by one 2024 study as, quote, the exchange of personal information about absent third parties, end quote. The study asserts that this practice dates back to the days of ancient Mesopotamia, which is like basically the Garden of Eden in terms of historical lineage. Ashley Darcy wrote in her article for The Good Trade on the origins of gossip, saying, quote, earlier in the 1400s, when these meanings of gossip were in circulation, there was no derogatory sense attached to them. In fact, Silvia Federici explains that, at the time, European women had their own activities and shared much of their lives and work with other women. Women cooperated with each other in every aspect of their life. This is in accord with the status of women elsewhere and throughout history, where they played an important role in the transmission of culture and in maintaining the fabric of their communities. At times, this has been a valuable and protected position. In other words, a woman's gossip was integral to society, end quote. Unfortunately, men ruined it. Darcy continues, quote, with the rise of a patriarchal order closely tied to the move towards capitalism initiated by the church and other feudal elite classes, women's power started to deteriorate. From the 1500s onwards, the meaning of gossip shifted in turn. As the status of women fell, their independence in speech and social formations with other women quickly became a threat. End quote. She points out that gossip is at the root of movements like Me Too or Ni Una Menos. Ni Una Menos, translating to not one less, is a movement directed at combating gender-based violence. Its catalyst? The murder of pregnant 14-year-old Kiara Paez at the hands of her boyfriend. Says Darcy, quote, "Today's widely accepted view of gossip as damaging and inane at the same time does double duty, both silencing women and reinforcing the idea that their speech is meaningless. In Federici's words, it is women who gossip, presumably having nothing better to do and having less access to real knowledge and information and a structural inability to construct factually based rational discourses. Thus, gossip is an integral part of the devaluation of women's personality and work, especially domestic work, reputedly the ideal terrain on which this practice flourishes." End quote. I bring all this up because I think there's a very real parallel between the hidden power of gossip and the kinds of movements that have emerged from women who consume crime media. For every creep writing fan mail to a serial killer, there are 10 women doing important work in their communities to address the injustices so many face today. Gabby Petito's family has created the Gabby Petito Foundation in the wake of her death. According to their website, quote, "The Gabby Petito Foundation is committed to driving real change in the fight against domestic violence and missing persons," end quote. Sarah Turney has turned the fight for justice for her sister Alyssa into a platform to raise awareness for other missing persons cases that fell through the cracks. Kendall Ray and her husband Josh created the Higher Hope Foundation to support victims and their families as they navigate the complex legal system. Stephanie Harlow and the co-host of her podcast Crime Weekly, the one and only Derek Levasseur, collaborated to build Criminal Coffee, a company that sells coffee and uses the profits to fund cold case investigations. There are more examples covered in this podcast, and more examples than that out in the world that simply wouldn't fit into my scripts. In my Intro to Mass Communications course, we covered a wide array of communication theories. One of the theories we covered is called narrative theory. Narrative theory, also referred to as narratology, has origins that trace back to ancient Greece and Aristotle, but the person most associated with our modern understanding of the theory is Vladimir Propp. Propp was born to a family of immigrants from Germany in St. Petersburg, Russia, in 1895. He attended university in St. Petersburg and eventually became a professor at Leningrad University. By 1936, at age 41, he took on the role of department head for the Department of Folklore at Leningrad, which was eventually renamed the Department of Russian Literature. Propp was a formidable scholar dedicated to the study of both Russian and German philology. His book, Morphology of the Folktale, was published in 1928 and is considered foundational to the study of narratology. In this groundbreaking work, Propp outlines his method of narrative analysis. According to Alan Dundes of UC Berkeley, who wrote an introduction for Morphology's second edition, quote, "In this type, the structure or formal organization of a folkloristic text is described following the chronological order of the linear sequence of elements in the text as reported from an informant. Thus, if a tale consists of elements A to Z, the structure of the tale is delineated in terms of this same sequence. Following Levi-Strauss, this linear sequential structural analysis we might term syntagmatic structural analysis, borrowing from the notion of syntax in the study of language. Anatoly Lieberman highlights a direct quote of Propp on his authorial intent in his introduction to Propp's Theory and History of Folklore, which reads, quote, "I called it Morphology of a Wonder Tale. To make the book more attractive, the editor replaced the word wonder tale, and it this way led everybody to believe the book would concern itself with the general laws of the folk tale. But my intention was not to study all the various and complex types of the folk tale. I examined only one strikingly distinctive type, the folk wonder tale. This book laid the groundwork for works by theorists like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Claude Bremond. Narrative theory, then, in modern terms, can be summed up in this definition given by Ohio State University's Project Narrative. It is the study of, quote, how stories help people make sense of the world, while also studying how people make sense of stories, end quote. I would argue that today it's used in education, specifically media analysis and literacy. I myself unknowingly participated in studying narrative theory, albeit in a roundabout and disheveled way, in this podcast, Obsessions. Ohio State University continues, quote, narratives of all kinds are relevant to the field. Literary fictions and non-fictions, film narratives, comics and graphic novels, hypertexts and other computer-mediated narratives, oral narratives occurring during the give and take of everyday conversation, as well as narratives told in courtrooms, doctors' offices, business conference rooms, indeed, anywhere, end quote. This makes narrative theory extremely important and relevant to our understanding of ourselves as people and the societies and cultures we live in. It may fall under the purview of the English or Communication Department at a university, but it is an interdisciplinary method of analysis, one that I personally believe people apply unconsciously all the time. I certainly did. In this podcast specifically, I used media theory to examine how narrative bias informs and influences Western audiences in their engagement with true crime media, and the chasm between the lived experiences of women of various intersections of identity versus the narrative surrounding crime. I did so because I hoped that popular media would be a useful entry point for understanding why these stories are important to us, an aid in my quest to educate the masses on our country's fraught infrastructure. As an autistic scholar, I find that drawing comparisons to popular media is a useful mnemonic in my studies for understanding and recalling certain ideas, and I hoped that applying it in my podcast might help people retain information. However, I am far from the first person to do this. A cursory search on YouTube can direct you to phenomenal video essays like Natalie Wynn's video essay Twilight, which examines the romance genre using Stephenie Meyers' Twilight as a case study, or Lindsay Ellis's autopsy of the live-action remake of Beauty and the Beast starring Emma Watson. Video essayists far and wide regularly apply narratology to understand humanity a little better, or at least the aspects of it they find interesting. Oftentimes, these works have a political bent insofar as they draw parallels between media and the contemporary political climate that influenced the work. Narratology is a rich, diverse, rapidly growing area of study that crosses disciplines, making it extremely relevant in modern academia. Narratology is a rich, diverse, rapidly growing area of study that crosses disciplines, making it extremely relevant in modern academia. It's a useful tool for education and analysis, and something that people routinely engage in without ever once even hearing of it. Fandom, fan communities dedicated to specific pieces of media typically fostered online, but often found in physical spaces, is a fertile breeding ground for such discourse. Anecdotally, the generation of fan communities that sprang up in the late 2000s and early 2010s in online spaces like Tumblr and Twitter, now X, must be partially credited for the theory's current popularity as the youth in these communities went on to attend college and find ways to academically engage with their interests. Narrative theory is a vital tool in teaching media literacy because it provides an analytical framework for understanding the meanings behind stories and the ways narratives can be influenced. This is the most essential way to distinguish fact from misinformation or disinformation. Because that's the test John Green was talking about in his first episode of Crash Course. The point of English class, the task we have been given as members of a functioning society, the best gift we can give each other as fellow human beings, it's literacy. It's understanding. And when we're trying to understand things, we tell stories. Sometimes these stories are scary. Sometimes they make us uncomfortable, and other times they teach us uncomfortable things about ourselves. But these stories are also an essential aspect of confronting these disquieting truths. Why are women so obsessed with murder? Why aren't you? This podcast was created, researched, written, produced, and edited by Sarah McDonald, with music by Zoe Blade. Views expressed on the podcast are my own or those of my guests, and do not necessarily reflect those of Southwestern Oklahoma State University or its faculty. Special thanks to Southwestern Oklahoma State University's Hilltop Theater, Professor Jessica Salmons-Meditz, Professor Stephen Dowdy, Dr. Matthew Dorr, and Jonathan Wynn for their help and mentorship through this project. Infinite hugs to Dylan, Cass, Joe, Shelley, Des, Lex, and Shy for putting up with my crazy writing schedule and my constant requests for feedback. Dedicated with love to Mrs. Rachel Anderson, my 8th grade English teacher, who made me believe I could do this.
The moral of this podcast is that you should read more.
Yes, always.